King of heaven is able to humble those who walk in pride, Nebuchadnezzar testifies. How's your humility? Are you self-important like Nebuchadnezzar was? Are you self-sufficient, self-made like Nebuchadnezzar thought he was? God gives him this dream of a tree that all the nations depend upon, the birds, the beasts, etc., pictured in this tree. But it gets cut down, and Nebuchadnezzar, pictured in that tree, is sent out from Babylon. And what happens with the kingdom of Babylon? It keeps going. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't indispensable after all. He wasn't the essential. No, he's a sovereign, but he's under the real sovereign, the true sovereign, who is the essential. In fact, in speaking to Belshazzar, there's a reference made back to this incident with Nebuchadnezzar. That's in chapter 5 with Belshazzar. And it speaks of Belshazzar's breath being in God's hand. The God in whose hand are your life breath and all your ways you have not glorified. Chapter 5, verse 23. So God is the real sovereign. He holds everything in his hand. Just think of it, your breath. You know, we breathe, and if we think we're self-sufficient, self-important, essential, one breath away, and I'm out of the equation. The Lord is the essential one. His kingdom endures. You know, we might never get in a position anywhere close to Nebuchadnezzar had, but we might have our sphere of authority. When you're in authority, do you operate like one who's under authority? In other words, under the Lord, under his authority? With Nebuchadnezzar, in describing him, chapter 5, verse 19, there's this phrase that's repeated, that God had given him the greatness over everyone, and everyone trembled. And whomever he wished, he killed, and whomever he wished, he spared alive. Whomever he wished, he elevated. Whomever he wished, he humbled. Chapter 5, verse 19. But when his heart was arrogant, and his spirit became so overbearing that he behaved presumptuously, arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his dignity was taken away from him. He was driven away from mankind. And so whomever he wished, he could do whatever he wanted with whoever he wanted. And so it sure seemed like he was the sovereign, but he wasn't after all. In fact, 4 times in chapter 4, the point of the dream is emphasized. Chapter 4, verse 17, that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and he grants it to whomever he wishes and sets over it the lowliest of men. You need to know that. The living need to know that. Verse 25, until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes. Verse 26, will remain as yours after you recognize that it is heaven that rules. Verse 32, until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes. And Nebuchadnezzar finally comes to the point of recognizing that the Most High does rule. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, verse 34, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are of no account, but he does according to his will among the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of earth, and no one can fend off his hand or say to him, what have you done? He's the only real sovereign. He can do according to his will in heaven and on earth, and no one can fend off his hand. His hand is in charge. Now, the kingdom had been handed over to Nebuchadnezzar, it says in chapter 2. And the last king during this times of the Gentiles, that's described in chapter 2 to 7, is this little horn of the Roman Empire. And it talks about the saints being handed over to him. But whose hand was handing him over? The true sovereign was handing it over to the first king and to the last king of this times of the Gentiles. I'm using the phrase from Luke 21:25, that I'd see this Aramaic section, chapter 2 to 7, as being picturing that. In fact, as you look at this section, you basically can see in chapter 2 and chapter 7, the kingdoms of men as a statue and as the 4 beasts, and God handing over sovereignty to them. In chapter 3 and 6, we see faithfulness to the Lord in some servants that are under the authority of these men, the trouble that comes upon them, and yet the Lord delivering from the hand of these sub-authorities, these sub-sovereigns. And then in chapter 4 and 5 is the Lord humbling these sub-authorities, these sub-sovereigns, if you will, and his hand and seen as no one can fend off his hand, chapter 4. And with Belshazzar, who won't humble himself, whose hand is his life breath and his ways, the hand appears and it writes his judgment on the wall. Weighed and found deficient, and so your kingdom taken away from you. Belshazzar, he says of him, chapter 5, verse 22, you knew about that with Nebuchadnezzar. You knew this, yet you didn't humble your heart. Do you humble your heart? Belshazzar instead takes the vessels from the house of God and drinks from them in complete disrespect, intentional disrespect for the Lord. And the true sovereign shows up that Belshazzar actually was under authority after all, because that very night the kingdom was removed from him and turned over to the Persians. But these Persians, they come along and they do according to their will. So mankind goes. We think that we can be self-sufficient. We can get to a place where we can do whatever we want. Do you live like that? Where you want to do whatever you want? If I can just get enough money, if I can just get these things lined up, if I can negotiate life well, I can do whatever I want. That's Nebuchadnezzar. Self-made, self-important, self-sufficient. Do you want to do whatever you want? The Son of God, when he came, he said, he didn't come to do whatever he wanted. He came to do the will of him who sent him. I come to do your will, O God, the Son of God says. That's the way to live. But the Persian Empire, he did as he pleases. Chapter 8, verse 4. Until the Greek Empire comes along and smashes and tramples him. And so this great edifice of power and authority smashed so quickly. So quickly. But Alexander the Great, guess what he's going to do? Chapter 11, 3 and 4. He will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. Until he dies young. And then his kingdom gets splintered up into these sub-kingdoms that are nothing in comparison to what he had established. And yet we celebrate this self-advancing, self-sufficient man, Alexander the Great, wanting to do whatever he wants. And he succeeded much more than you and I ever will. So maybe people will learn the lesson? No, the Seleucids and Ptolemies, they're going to fight with each other. And when they lose, what are they going to do? We'll just get a bigger army. Chapter 11, verse 13. I'll raise a greater multitude. And there's this delusion that somehow if I get a bigger army and I conquer, that's going to be the final battle. And then I'll be in charge and I'll be the true sovereign. And we live like that, just in a smaller version. The ultimate of the Seleucids was Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He called himself Theos Epiphanes, God made manifest. Not so much, huh? Well, he seemed to have success for a time. In fact, he persecutes the people of God. This is in chapter 8. He persecutes the people of God, and it says he will do as he pleases and be successful. 8, 12, and 24 speaks of this. Chapter 8, verse 12 and verse 24. And not only does he cause trouble for the people of God, he succeeds against God, it seems. It says he will even oppose the prince of princes, verse 25. He'll remove the regular sacrifice from him. You don't have a sacrifice anymore, God. And the place of his, God's sanctuary, will be overthrown. But it's only for a time. The vision of the evenings and the mornings, which has been told is true, verse 26. God was sovereign over all of it, and the sanctuary is going to be restored in God's time. And God was even allowing it due to wrongdoers, verse 23, to judge transgression, verse 19. So God was sovereign even over this vile, despicable man. His apparent success was under the sovereignty of God. And of him, it says, verse 24, 25 of chapter 8, he will. He seems to be so successful, but he will be broken without human agency. May the Lord deliver us from this vanity of self-will, the illusion of self-sufficiency, the illusion of greatness. But mankind isn't going to be, because in the time of the end, chapter 11, it speaks of this king, the fullest example of self-will. Self-importance. The king will do as he pleases. Chapter 11, verse 36. He will exalt himself and boast against every god, and will speak dreadful things against the God of gods. And he will be successful. That's the thing that blows our mind sometimes. They seem to be successful. He will be successful until the indignation is finished, because that which is determined will be done. The Lord was sovereign over it all. In fact, God was bringing about judgment according to his sovereignty. So he is success under God's sovereignty. Now, he's not recognizing God's sovereignty, but the God was still sovereign. He causes all kinds of trouble for the saints, chapter 7, like Antiochus IV did. He exalts himself, and he doesn't just set an idol in the temple. He sets himself up as God in the temple. 2 Thessalonians 2 tells us, seating himself as God in the temple. But how will it end? he will come to his end, and no one will help him, chapter 11:45. So he's not sovereign after all, not self-sufficient after all. And yet we keep doing this. How about you? You trying to be self-sufficient? Are you seeking to be self-made, striving to get to the place where you can do whatever you want? May the Lord deliver us from this delusion, but also this idolatry. It is idolatry, isn't it? We're living like we're God. God's the only one that can do whatever he wants and really should be able to do whatever he wants. What we want to do is do what he wants. The joy of doing what the Lord Jesus wants. So these sub-sovereigns, they do have power, and sometimes it causes trouble for his people, like we showed chapter 3 verse and chapter 6. Nebuchadnezzar's arrogance, he tries to kill Daniel's friends, but God rescues them. Chapter 6, the arrogance of Daniel's people that were competing with Daniel, though Daniel wasn't competing with them. They're power hungry and jealous, and he gets thrown into the lion's den, and he's supposed to die, but he doesn't because God rescues him. God is able to humble, chapter 4 and 5. God's able to rescue, chapter 3 and 6. Rescue those that are faithful to him, that are under authority. He's able to deliver them. He had handed over the rule to Nebuchadnezzar, the first king, to the little horn, the last king. But along the way, he can deliver from their hands, chapters 3 and 6. And ultimately, his hand is sovereign over them. No one can fend off his hand, and he can take back the authority from these sub-sovereigns. So may the Lord encourage us. There's times when delegated authority is misused, but God delivers, and he holds the authorities responsible. God's hand sovereignly delegates, but God's hand sovereignly delivers as well. And God does hold responsible those under authority. All right, so let's learn the lesson from Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar to not be self-important. God's able to humble the proud. And the better way is if we humble ourselves. In the words of 1 Peter 5, humble yourself under the mighty hand of God. He's the mighty one. I'm not. Humble yourself under the mighty hand of God. Allow God to be the sovereign. In all your ways, acknowledge him. What a great way to live, dependent upon him. And let's learn the example from Daniel and his friends. There's times we're under authority, but we're going to depend upon the true authority, the sovereign. He's able to rescue us. He can decide if he wants to rescue us, but we're going to trust in him. We're going to commit ourselves to him, to his hand, his sovereign hand. Or in the words of Psalm 31, as for me, I will trust in you, Lord. I say, you are my God. My times are in your hand. My times are in your hand. What a great way to live. So how's your humility? Do you handle being in authority like you're under authority? How do you handle being under authority? Are you submissive? Do you welcome submission, or do you kick at it? Are you happy to acknowledge Christ's headship? He's the head of the church, right? We're part of the church. Christ is the head. He's in authority. Are you happy to acknowledge that? Even in ways that he specifically directs, like submitting to elders, 1 Peter 5, like the symbolic practices that celebrate his headship, 1 Corinthians 11, like submitting to fellow believers as we function in the church, Ephesians chapter 5, like allowing Christ to guide in the members of his body, Ephesians chapter 4, since he's the head. Do you see yourself as self-sufficient, self-made? Are you trying to be that? Do you see yourself as indispensable, that everyone else needs you? Self-important. Well, may the Lord help us. May the Lord encourage us in depending upon him, living a life of dependence, this restful, joyful life of God is God, and I'm going to depend upon him. May the Lord encourage you and I to live a humble life of dependence upon the living God.